Hi. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the cross sections of the brainstem, and this is a topic that I find or see students struggling with, and that's mainly because it's harder for them to picturize or to imagine or to understand why is there a specific structure present in a specific part of that cross section of the brainstem. So before we begin, the brainstem, as we already probably know, that it's comprised of three parts: a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla. So midbrain is the superiormost part, pons is the middle part, and medulla is the lowermost part. And we're going to be drawing the cross section of the midbrain, and specifically at the level of the inferior colliculus right now in this video. So just a bit of general anatomy, gross anatomy, that the midbrain, the superiormost part of the brainstem, that is right below the cerebrum, that is grossly comprised of certain swellings or projections on its posterior end. They are important to us because they would be shown in the cross section as well. Those swellings are called the colliculi. So we have a pair that is superiorly placed, called the superior colliculus, and a pair that's inferiorly placed, that's called the inferior colliculus. And they have functions related to vision and visual reflexes and sound reflexes, right? So before we begin, there are certain ground rules that you guys need to know in order to draw a cross section, right? So if it's any cross section of any part of the brainstem, you need to consider three or four things when you're drawing a cross section. What are those three things? The first thing is going to be any fibers, or any tract coming in or ascending fibers. Then you have to consider any fibers coming down or descending fibers that are just going through and through the cross section. Then you need to consider any fibers emerging or coming out. Emerging or coming out at that specific level. Then we have a fourth thing that might be considered in some cross sections, and that's any specific structures present. Right? So whenever you're considering drawing a cross section, before you even begin, you need to know four things. You need to know that the cross section you're drawing, theoretically, you should be aware of that what fibers or what tracts are ascending through it and what fibers are descending through it. So that's two things that you need to consider. The third thing is going to be any fibers or any tracts or anything that is going to be emerging at that specific level from that part of the brainstem. And the fourth part that might be present in some of the cross sections is that is there any specific structure that is characteristic to that part of the brainstem. So these four things kept in mind, you need to then start drawing a cross section of the brainstem. So when we consider these four things, you need to know that the brainstem internally is divided into three parts. Just like externally it's divided into a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla, internally it's also divided into three parts. So there's one part, let me select a marker. So let's choose brown. Okay, so the brainstem can be divided generally internally into three parts. So the first part, anteriorly, the ventral part, is called the basis, or in terms or in relation to the midbrain, when talking about the midbrain, it's specifically called as the crus cerebri. Hopefully the spelling is right. So the first part, the anterior ventral part, is named as the crus cerebri. Why is it named the crus cerebri? Because crus means legs or a limb. So this is the part that is going to be supporting or going to be connected to the cerebrum above it. So it appears as if it's just an extension or the lower limb of the brain. That's why crus cerebri, the limb or the leg of the cerebrum. Then we have another layer in the middle, and this middle layer is given the name throughout the brainstem generally as tegmentum, right? So this layer is going to be called as tegmentum. So this middle part or middle internally division is going to be called as tegmentum. The tegmentum means covering, so it sort of is a covering in between the brainstem. Maybe that's why it was named tegmentum, but Lord knows. So crus cerebri makes sense, tegmentum not so much. And then lastly, we have this posterior most part that even though is a general structure internally of the brainstem, it's more specifically labeled or talked about when we're talking about the midbrain. And the most posterior part is called as the tectum, and tectum means roof. So it's the posterior most part. It forms the roof on all of these two structures or these two structures. So tectum, the posterior most, tegmentum, and crus cerebri. So this was the second concept, that when drawing a cross section, you need to consider that there are certain tracts that are going in and out and emerging from it, and certain specific structures that are specific to that particular cross section. And then you need to know that the brainstem is divided internally into three parts: an anterior crus cerebri, as you can see over here, a middle tegmentum, and a posterior tectum. So whichever cross-section you're drawing, a medulla, a pons, a midbrain cross-section, you need to keep these three parts in mind. Now the third concept is related to these three parts. So the crus cerebri or the basis is going to be having all the descending tracts. All the descending tracts or fibers, right? So whenever you draw a cross section, it's going to be the ventral most part, also known as the basis, or in midbrain, the crus cerebri is going to be having the descending tracts. So whatever descending tracts you have in your mind, you're going to be drawing them in this part of the cross section. Then we have tegmentum. Tegmentum is going to be having all the ascending fibers, that means sensory fibers, all the ascending fibers, right? And it's also going to be having, plus, also going to be having cranial nerve nuclei. So it's this point that I was talking about, that the fourth concept or the fourth point to keep in mind when drawing a cross section is that any specific structures or anything emerging from the cross section. So the cranial nerve nuclei, from them we would have the cranial nerve that's going to be emerging from specific parts of the brainstem, and you need to be aware of those cranial nerves in order to draw them. But if you are aware of them, you need to know that where are you going to draw them? You're going to draw them in the center part, that is going to be tegmentum. So all the ascending fibers, all of the cranial nerve nuclei, they're going to be drawn in the tegmental area. This area is only going to be having all the descending or motor tracts. Now we're left with tectum. So tectum doesn't really have important structures in the pons and the medulla, but it does have two important structures in the midbrain, and those are your colliculi. So colliculi, we have a superior colliculi plus inferior colliculi. But at this level, we're only going to be talking about the inferior colliculi because that's where this section is going to be drawn from. Now you would be probably thinking that what exactly is the demarcating point between these three structures? And that's when we start drawing our cross section. The structure that divides in the midbrain, that divides the basis or the crus cerebri from the tegmentum, is a cluster or a big group of gray matter that is termed as the substantia nigra. Is termed as the substantia nigra. Okay? So substantia nigra is concerned with motor system, and it's going to be the separating point or the border between the crus cerebri in the midbrain and the tegmentum of the midbrain. So that's the first thing that you would draw in your cross section. So this is going to be called, the entire structure is going to be called as substantia nigra. And it's called nigra because it has a lot of melanin pigments, so it appears to be darkly stained. That's why it's called substantia nigra, and it has to do with the motor system. Okay, then we have something between tectum and tegmentum that's going to be dividing them. And then the second structure that you're going to draw over here is going to be a structure towards the center, and this is the cerebral aqueduct, or in previous books or in previous times it was called the cerebral duct of Sylvius or the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, but we don't call it that now. So this is the cerebral aqueduct that you have to draw. And what would it have? Yes, it's going to connect the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, and it would have CSF, so cerebral aqueduct. After that, what would you draw in the tectum? So basically cerebral aqueduct, posterior to it we would have the tectum, and anterior to it till the substantia nigra we would have the tegmentum. So we drew or marked the differentiating points or the separating medians for these three structures or these three internal areas. Now the third thing that you're going to draw is going to be in the tectum region, and it's going to be these structures over here. What are these? Because this is the inferior colliculi level, these are going to be inferior colliculus, and that is the only structure that is going to be drawn or present in the tectal region. So you start off with the midbrain cross section at the inferior colliculi stage by drawing at least these things. That you drew this shape of the midbrain. The reason behind that shape is that because, and the reason that this is called a crus is because in between these two areas we have a space in between. So it's just sort of a beam. Midbrain can be considered a beam that is supporting the cerebrum, and it's connecting it with the pons and then the medulla below. So in between these two beams named as the crus cerebri, we have this space which is called the interpeduncular fossa. Interpeduncular fossa, and because of this space these appear as limbs, hence the name crus cerebri. So that is the reason why this cross section has this sort of a space. We need to show the interpeduncular fossa, this space in between. Then you would show the substantia nigra dividing the crus cerebri or basis from the tegmental area. Then you're going to draw the cerebral aqueduct that is going to be present at the border of the tegmentum and the tectum. So behind it is going to be the tectal region. And then in the tectum, you're going to draw these two circular figures that are going to be the inferior colliculus that is concerned with hearing reflexes or sound reflexes or anything related to the sound or hearing, right? Okay. After that, so what have we covered so far? We have covered any specific structures present in the midbrain. So the specific structures so far are the substantia nigra, that is going to be present throughout the midbrain. So this is going to be found at the superior colliculi level as well as the inferior colliculi level. After that, we drew inferior colliculus that is very specific to only this cross section or part of the cross section. Okay. Now we're going to talk about any fibers coming down or descending. So if we have any descending fibers, where are they going to be drawn? They're going to be drawn in this area. And there's only one major descending tract that you should be aware of at this stage, and that is the corticospinal tract. So where are we supposed to draw the corticospinal tract? It comprises, or it houses, or it covers middle 2/3 of the crus cerebri. So you would draw this area over here, right? So the fibers are descending in this area. If you want to, you can draw arrows on them just to show that they're descending tracts, or you can just label this area, right? So this is going to be the corticospinal tract. And this is the main descending tract that you need to be aware of and you need to draw. We have two more descending tracts on each side. They are the frontopontine tract and the parieto-pontine tracts, but we don't need to label them in this picture because that's at an advanced level. So we drew the corticospinal tract, and thereby we completed this rule or concept, right? So we made any descending fibers that were present. After that, we need to know any ascending fibers that are going to be ascending through this cross section. And the three fibers or the three tracts we have: the DCML pathway, the dorsal column medial lemniscus, that's the most important. We also have a spinal lemniscus that's concerned or comprised of anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract, and spinotectal tract. So we need to draw medial lemniscus, we need to draw spinal lemniscus, and we also need to draw two more sensory or ascending pathways that you should be aware of, but the previous two ones are the main ones that, at least if you don't remember the other two, you're supposed to know or remember the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus. So where are they placed? They are going to be placed obviously in the tegmental area, like we've talked about it, but they're going to be a bit laterally, right? They're going to be a bit laterally. So we're going to just, and the good thing about this is that they're going to be grouped together, right? So they're going to be grouped together. The first part is going to be medial lemniscus. A bit dorsal to it, we would have the spinal lemniscus. So this part is going to be called as the spinal lemniscus. Then we would have a tract that is known as the lateral lemniscus. This is concerned with the vestibular system, cochlear vestibular system related to sound and balance. And then we have one more that I won't be able to write because it's going to be very cramped up. This is going to be the trigeminal lemniscus that is coming from the trigeminal nuclei from rest of the brainstem. So these are the three parts that you're going to draw collectively, right? So you can draw this in this shape. And you can mention this as medial lemniscus, so we will write ML. This as spinal lemniscus, we would write it as SL. Then lateral lemniscus, LL. And then trigeminal lemniscus, TL, right? After that, this is the most, or these are the most important ascending tracts that you need to draw at this level, especially these two, medial lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus, and then the lateral lemniscus and trigeminal lemniscus. So these four lemnisci are the ones that you're going to draw. After that, are there any more ascending tracts? No, not really. There aren't really any more ascending tracts, but there are three more things that are happening in this area or at this cross section. So from these, we have again covered the ascending fibers, we have covered the descending fibers, and we have covered any specific structures present, them being substantia nigra, tectum, and cerebral aqueduct if you want to. Now we need to know that any fibers emerging coming out. At this level, we have one of the cranial nerves of the brainstem that is going to be emerging from the midbrain. And that nerve at the level of the inferior colliculus is going to be the fourth cranial nerve, named as the trochlear nerve. But the fact about trochlear nerve and the feature, specific characteristic feature of the trochlear nerve is that it is the only cranial nerve that is going to exit the brainstem posteriorly. Rest of the cranial nerves exit the brainstem anteriorly, but this nerve is going to exit it posteriorly, and it's also going to be the only nerve that is going to cross to the opposite side completely. Rest of the cranial nerves do not cross. So the nucleus for the trochlear nerve is very close to the midline. So we're going to draw these two nuclei over here. And you can label them as the trochlear nerve nuclei if you want to. So let's label them as trochlear nerve nucleus. After that, we have to show the nerve. Now we have to show that again it's going to be emerging posteriorly and it's going to be crossing. So you need to show it in this fashion. Right? So this is going to be labeled as the trochlear nerve itself. Trochlear nerve, that is the fourth cranial nerve. Okay, so over here we showed the trochlear nerve. I'm going to remove this labeling because it seems like a cranial nerve as well. So you can label that as the trochlear nerve nucleus, but you have to show the nerves that are emerging posteriorly and they are crossing to the opposite side. They emerge and they exit posteriorly and then come forward laterally, because eventually the structures that they are going to supply the muscle of the eye. Which muscle? Not going to cover that, that's for another lecture. So, but superior oblique. After that, you need to draw two more things. There's a thing called medial longitudinal fasciculus, and that is a tract, or that is a collection of fibers or axons that are connecting certain cranial nerve nuclei throughout the brainstem on one side with their counterparts on the other side for conjugatory movements, for synchronized movements, right? So you have to show that as well over here. Let's draw that with yellow. So some books say that it's anterior to this, some books say it's posterior to this, but you just need to show them that you have the knowledge that this is going to be present at this level. Right? So this yellow structure is going to be the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So let's label that as medial M longitudinal fasciculus MLF. Okay? The last thing that is remaining over here is, if you remember, there's a tract called anterior spinocerebellar tract. And if you remember your basic tract neuroanatomy, you know that it's one of the cerebellar tracts that is going to cross to the opposite side while entering the spinal cord. So because it crosses over to the other side when it enters the spinal cord, the rule for the cerebellum is that any tract that's coming into it or coming out from it, it's supposed to be ipsilaterally, right? It's supposed to be from the same side of the body. But because anterior spinocerebellar tract already crossed to the opposite side, it needs to cross back again to go back to its original side of the cerebellum. And that happens at this level. Happens in the midbrain, but at what level of the midbrain? The inferior colliculus level of the midbrain. So the last thing that you need to draw in this cross section is the crossing over of those fibers. So let's draw them over here with green. I don't know if this works. right? So this crossing is going to be the anterior spinocerebellar tract crossing. So there we have it. This is the complete cross section of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculus. So again, just a quick recap because this video is already too long. But this is because it also contains the concepts and the things that you need to consider when you're drawing the brainstem. So what were those four things? They were that any cross section that you're supposed to draw, you should know the general outline of the shape of that cross section. Even if you don't, that's fine. Just make an oval or make a circle, but at least get other things right. So the four things you need to consider are any tracks ascending through it, any tracks descending through it, any specific structures present in that specific part of the brainstem, and anything or any fibers that are emerging or coming out from that part of the brainstem. When you keep these four things in mind, it's easy to draw these things. Out of these four things, the descending tracts are going to be in the anterior part, the anterior third, called the crus cerebri, or the basis that is going to be present throughout the brainstem. The sensory or ascending pathways and cranial nerve and their nuclei are going to be present in the tegmental area, so they're going to be drawn over there. That's going to be throughout the brainstem. And then we have the tectal area or the tegmentum that, even though specifically pronounced or specifically characteristic of the midbrain, it's still present in the rest of the brainstem as well. But in the midbrain, it would have these two structures: inferior colliculi, ascending tracts in the tegmentum, and the descending tract, mainly corticospinal, in the basis or the crus cerebri. So there we have it. I hope this helped and cleared up some of the concepts. The next cross sections videos are going to be shorter because I've already given the concepts and everything. So yeah, cheers.